Welcome to The Explainer. So today we're going on a bit of a detective journey to uncover the true and honestly pretty wild story behind the blue moon. Now, we've all used the phrase once in a blue moon, right? We use it to mean something that happens super rarely. But where did that idea actually come from? Is this some ancient astronomical tradition, a super rare visual phenomenon, or is it something else entirely? Well, the answer is a crazy ride through centuries of history, science, and surprisingly enough, a few very modern typos. So let's dive right in and break this all down together.
Let's actually kick things off by looking way back at this bizarre poem from 1528. This is literally the earliest known written use of the phrase blue moon. It showed up in an English satire called Read Me and Be Not Wroth. And here's the funny thing. Back then, calling the moon blue had absolutely zero to do with astronomy or calendars. It was just a highly sarcastic joke. It meant something totally absurd. If someone seriously told you the moon was blue, it was basically the 16th century equivalent of telling you the moon is made of green cheese or that pigs can fly. It was just a hilarious metaphor for a blatant lie.
Okay, but before we get totally lost in all the calendar quirks and the word history that led to what we believe today, we really have to ask the most obvious, literal question. Can the atmospheric phenomenon of a visually blue moon actually happen in real life? Like, does the physical, rocky moon up on our sky ever literally turn the color blue to human eyes?
And, well, surprisingly, yes, it actually does. But it requires an incredibly specific, almost impossible set of natural conditions. For the moon to actually look blue, you need highly specific airborne particles up in the Earth's atmosphere, and they have to be exactly 1 micrometer in diameter. That precise condition is almost never met naturally, except during massive, world-altering cataclysms. It's truly mind-boggling. For instance, historical records show that people saw visually blue and green moons for months on end after the catastrophic Krakatoa volcano eruption in 1883. It also happened in 1950 when massive muskeg fires smoldering up in Alberta, Canada suddenly blew up, sending oily droplets of exactly 1 micrometer across North America and, incredibly, all the way over to Europe.
That specific science perfectly explains why red moons are actually pretty common, while a true blue moon is astronomically rare. Normally, when fires or storms throw a bunch of ash and dust into the sky, it creates this chaotic mixture of particle sizes, mostly smaller than 1 micrometer. That scattered mixture blocks out blue light, allowing the red light to pass straight through. But to see a blue moon, you need a uniform cloud of particles slightly wider than the wavelength of red light, that magical 1 micrometer size with almost no other sizes mixed in. Those specific particles scatter the red and yellow light instead, letting only the blue pass through to our eyes.
All right, jumping from hard science back into folklore, it's kind of wild how the modern calendar definition of the blue moon got so incredibly tangled up with myths. If you search around online, you're almost guaranteed to stumble across a very popular claim that the phrase comes from the Old English word belewan, which means to betray. The story goes that a second full moon in a month betrayed the usual calendar, and the phrase simply evolved from betrayer moon into blue moon. I mean, it sounds like a perfectly logical piece of ancient history, doesn't it?
Here's the thing, though. It is a completely groundless myth. Yes, the word for blue in Middle English was indeed spelled blue, but etymologists in the Oxford English Dictionary confirm there's absolutely zero historical link to the word for betray. In fact, we know exactly where this myth started. A writer proposed this betrayer moon theory as a fun, creative piece of speculation in Natural History magazine back in 1999. It sounded so good that it just took off like wildfire, even though the author himself later publicly admitted his speculation was 100% wrong. The internet, of course, didn't care and just kept running with it anyway.
Oh, and here's another widespread myth you'll hear all the time. It places the blame squarely on unlucky medieval monks. The story claims that monks who managed the super complex task of calculating the calendar found the 13th moon in a single year to be highly unlucky because it messed up their regular arrangement of church festivals. But in reality, there is zero historical evidence that an extra moon was considered unlucky or that any monk ever called it blue. Actually, historical monks, like Bede in the 8th century, were brilliant, expert astronomers. They accurately tracked extra moons because the date of Easter completely depended on it. They just quietly added an extra month to the summer and moved on. No panic, no bad luck, and definitely no blue labels.
So the real history, it is honestly way funnier than the myths. Starting back in 1528 with our absurd joke about the moon being blue, the phrase shifts slightly by the 1800s. Saying once in a blue moon slowly evolves into a metaphor for something that takes a very long time. But then we hit the 20th century,
And a massive media mix-up between 1937 and 1946 completely rewrote the definition of the phrase for the entire world, and it gave us the exact calendar rules we use today.
Okay, it really kicks off in 1937 when the Maine Farmer's Almanac published an article explaining the so-called ancient rules of the blue moon, claiming it was the third full moon in a season that has 4. They provided this whole elaborate history about monks and unlucky 13th moons, which, as we just learned, was completely fake. Modern astronomers and folklorists have searched intensely, and there is no record whatsoever of this seasonal rule existing anywhere before 1937. It turns out, historians today heavily suspect that the almanac's editor completely invented this rule either as a practical joke, a total hoax, or just a highly creative bit of writing to sell more almanacs.
But honestly, the story gets even better from here. Fast forward 9 years to 1946. An amateur astronomer named James Hugh Pruitt was writing an article for the highly respected magazine Sky and Telescope. He was referencing that 1937 almanac, but he misread it. He accidentally misinterpreted their complicated seasonal hoax and wrote down a much simpler rule instead, that a blue moon is simply the second full moon in a single calendar month. With that one entirely innocent typo, Pruitt inadvertently invented the modern 2 full moons in a month rule that the whole world blindly uses today.
And the craziest part is just how incredibly fast this one simple mistake morphed into global folklore. Because it was published in a major astronomy magazine, people naturally assumed it was cold, hard, ancient scientific fact. It sat quietly for a few decades, until the 1980s when it absolutely exploded into pop culture. It was broadcast on the Stardate national radio program in 1980, it was printed as an absolute fact in the Kids' World Almanac in 1985, and then it got the ultimate seal of cultural approval. It became a question in the Trivial Pursuit board game in 1986. Suddenly, a 1946 typo was cemented into our culture as a centuries-old tradition.
So why does Pruitt's accidental calendrical blue moon even happen at all? Well, we don't need any more folklore for that. We just have to look at the simple math contrasting the moon's orbit with our Earth's solar calendar. Our calendar months are mostly 30 or 31 days long. But the lunar cycle, the time it takes for the moon to go from full to new and back to full again, is slightly shorter. It takes approximately 29.53 days. If you take the Earth's tropical year of roughly 365.24 days and divide it by the 29.53 days of the lunar cycle, it doesn't divide cleanly. Instead, we get 12 full moons a year plus a leftover remainder of 0.37 lunar cycles. Because the lunar cycle is shorter than our actual months, the date of the full moon actually falls back by nearly 1 full day every single calendar month. And because that tiny little 0.37 remainder piles up year after year, the math guarantees that eventually an extra full moon has to get squeezed right into our calendar. Specifically, it happens roughly every 2.7 years. Every 2 or 3 years, that shifting lunar schedule aligns perfectly, so a full moon happens on the very first day or 2 of a month, which leaves just enough time for a second full moon to sneak in right at the tail end of that exact same month. And thanks entirely to Mr. Pruitt's typo in 1946, we confidently call that second moon blue.
So at the end of the day, while the calendrical blue moon has absolutely zero astronomical significance, its story is just a brilliant reminder of how human culture works. We crave meaning and tradition, so much so that a 16th century joke can become a 19th century metaphor, which inspires a 1930s almanac hoax, which leads to a 1940s typo, which ultimately becomes an unquestioned global fact by the 1980s. It leaves us with a fascinating and honestly pretty provocative question. What other ancient folklore that we implicitly trust today is really just a hoax or a 20th century typo waiting to be discovered? Keep questioning, keep learning, and thank you so much for joining me on this explainer.